Welcome, everyone. As you just heard, today we'll be taking you through a webinar on key messages and media strategies. And our first section is key messages. I'm going to stop periodically for questions. There'll be a green screen with a question mark on it, and then I'll pull up the panel again so that I can see your questions. We welcome questions as we go along, and so please ask anything that you need to. Toward the end of this webinar, I'm going to give you a chance to practice, so you will be able to try and write a key message for your hospice, and at that time I'll tell you the amount of time that I'm allowing for each block of each exercise. The first part will be taking you through the strategies and the approach. So let's get started. As I mentioned, today we're talking about key messages because key messages are the building block for effective communications. And today our goal is to learn an approach to messaging that will help you do just that. And I'll spend a bit of time reviewing the why and how, and then we'll roll up our sleeves to practice, as I mentioned. Great. And so the other thing about the questions is I'd be grateful if you do ask them, because then I understand whether or not there's something that I'm missing or something that you're not following. So as I said, ask questions, get messy, and do have fun. Key messaging is not easy, even for large organizations with communications professionals with many years of experience. So don't be afraid if it feels a bit awkward. That's normal. At the outset, I'm wondering, does your hospice think it needs a communication plan? Are you thinking about what kind of communications you need to do? Are people telling you, gee, we should be out on social media, it's free? So what we want to think about is, before we think about a communications plan, what are some of the things that we need to have in advance? And one of the things I like about this cartoon is just what I mentioned, is that people will always say, oh, social media is free. Well, actually it isn't free, because your time to manage social media is definitely worth something. And beyond that, it's not very effective if you are out on social media before you really understand what you want to achieve and say. And that's what we're here to talk about today. The foundation of any successful communications and marketing plan is answering the following 4 questions. What are your goals and objectives? Who do you want to reach to meet this goal? And what you're going to find out today is the general public is not an answer. We have to define our target market and target audience more minutely than the general public. And then, what do you want them to think, feel, and do? So often people think, well, we just need people to be aware. They need to be aware of us. Awareness by itself does not lead to action. And then, what can you say to make this happen? And what you can say to make this happen is what we're going to talk about today, which is the key messages. So in terms of goals, do you feel your hospice is misunderstood, unknown, underfunded, in need of volunteers? These may be some of the areas you're thinking about or talking about amongst yourselves when someone says, gee, maybe we need a communications plan. I'm going to open it up if anyone has any questions before I go further.
Yes, it's Bruce. May I ask a question?
Certainly.
Okay, I'm wondering if we're going to get a copy of your presentation, or do we need to take detailed notes?
No, you don't need to take notes. Okay. Jennifer will be putting both the recording and the slides up on your website at a later date. Great question, though.
Excellent, thanks.
Any other questions? Doesn't look like it. Great. Okay. So we've talked about goals. So we talked about what are your goals? Is it to make sure you're not misunderstood? Is it for fundraising? Is it for recruiting volunteers? So once you've settled on a very specific goal, then you think about, well, who is our target audience? And I'm sure you've probably heard the statement in other things, other areas, is that you can't be all things to all people. And in addition to that, I would tell you that if you try to talk to everyone, you talk to no one. And you need to focus on a target audience. You need to focus on the people who are most receptive to what you have to say. And in the nonprofit sector or in the public sector, there's a real tendency to try to talk to the general public. And the general public consists of many different segments with different interests, values, and motivations. And that's why we say you simply can't be all things to all people. Because if you make your messaging so generic that you think it applies to everyone, then you won't reach a target segment because your messaging won't have any meaning to them. It won't tap into their personal values and motivations. So even if you think you want to talk to a broad population, you need to break it down into several segments and then choose the ones that you're actually going to focus on. It's often useful while you're thinking about a target audience to think about the receptiveness of a particular segment. It's very difficult to reach opposed and apathetic people. It's an expensive and long-term proposition. Where you want to start is the persuadable. Who is most persuadable? And then don't forget the supportive. Some people will say don't preach to the choir, but in this case, arming your supporters with strong messages helps them become your advocates. Okay, again, any questions about target audience, making sure that you don't talk to the public? Is that something you're comfortable with and understand why we're saying that's not a good strategy? Doesn't sound like it. Great, we'll keep going. So as I've said earlier, avoid awareness as your communications goal. That is one of the number one pitfalls that I hear, even in people who've been in communications for many years. Awareness, they say, I want to build awareness, and I say, avoid that as your goal. At the outset, I encourage you to think beyond awareness. So if you're speaking if you only achieve awareness, you'll not move the needle in a meaningful way because awareness is generally quickly forgotten. Think about yourself. Think about all the things you're involved in, all the people that are trying to reach you, all the different organizations in your community that even you value and think are important. How aware are you of the things that they've said to you last week, last month, 6 months ago? It just doesn't stick. You have to be thinking about where you take your awareness. Awareness is the first step, but then it's where do you take that awareness? Is it knowledge, action, conviction? That's really where you want to get to. So as Steve Jobs once said, this is a very complicated world. It's a very noisy world, and we're not going to get the chance to get people to remember much about us. So we have to be really clear on what we want them to know about us. So when in that statement is what we want them to know about us, that can be thought of as the key messages, and that's what we're talking about today. And the them in that statement, as you know, when he says we have to be really clear on what we want them to know about us, that's your target audience. So even in a company like Apple that's ubiquitous around the world, they think very clearly about the few things they're going to say and the people that they're actually talking to. So what are key messages? As we said earlier, key messages provide the building blocks for communications, and they help you. They help you stay organized when speaking to the media or with your stakeholders. They ensure consistent, accurate, and compelling information is being presented about your hospice, and they improve understanding of you. So a real simple way to think about key messages, it's the 3 or 4 key concepts or ideas that you want your target audience to hear, remember, and act upon. Your goal is to educate or persuade a target audience. And in order to do that, it has your concepts and messaging have to be distilled down to the most important information. And there's a saying that I like is that I would have written a shorter note, but I didn't have time. Because distillation takes time. It's a lot of work and effort to really be clear on the simple things you want to say and how to say them. So know that as you're distilling your key messages, it takes time and it's a challenging exercise. So you're going to want to devote some thinking and conversation around that. Secondly, they build consistency as the message is the same regardless of who it is coming from. And so it's not only who, so your key messages are used by everyone in the organization that is charged with communicating. It's also used across all your communication vehicles, whether that be presentations, person-to-person conversations, social media, press releases. You have always refer to your key messages before you decide what you're going to say, who you're going to say it to. And then a really valuable thing about key messages is if you do them in a group at your hospice, it creates an internal consensus on what is most important to communicate. And that builds alignment. And you'll have some very important and valuable conversations as you go through that exercise. The thing that key messages are not, they are not copy or a slogan. And what we mean by copy is that's what's written in a brochure, a public-facing brochure. You don't have to wordsmith yourself as you write key messages, because if you're speaking to them at a presentation, you might take 10 minutes to get a concept across. If you're going on social media, if you're on Twitter, for example, you've got 140 characters to get your message across. So don't wordsmith yourself. We're really talking about the core concepts. Key messages are not a fact, statistic, or jargon. So facts and statistics are support for your key message. It's what's make people believe you. That in and of itself is not a key message. And jargon, it's very easy when you're so close to a topic to use words that other people don't understand. We always avoid jargon. Even if it's an internal statement, your key message is the concept, don't use jargon in it. And they're not intended to be used word for word. I think that's pretty obvious for what we've just talked about. And one thing about key messages, because they generate, you have to think about person-to-person conversations, simple, common, everyday language. And they're brought to life with the word choice you use, the anecdotes and the stories. Developing key messages is something that I do with a large number of organizations because it is challenging. You have to get everyone in the room, get that agreement, get that distillation. And at the end of it all, when you look at your key messages, you go, wow, we did all that work for just this simple 3 key messages. And the answer is yes. So when you distill it down, get the core concepts, and deliver them in simple and everyday language, that's exactly what you were trying to do. And of course, messaging always comes to life in a story. People remember stories. People respond emotionally to stories. So key messaging is enriched with anecdotes and stories. And that's what will really build that memory about you. And also people can share a story. When you tell someone a story to get your message across, they remember the story. And so when they're trying to convey the things that you told them, they're going to repeat your story. And it's something that you want to document. So the anecdotes and the stories that you think are most powerful, that also becomes part of your arsenal for communicating to stakeholders, both internal and external. Okay, so any questions? I'll just give it a little bit more time in case someone's typing. friend Carol's just pointed out that there is a box on your screen for questions. And if there's a plus sign, it means that it's folded up. So if you hit the plus sign, then you'll see questions, and there's a place to type them in case some of you hadn't seen that. Oh, okay. Well, we'll keep going. So why are key messages important? Well, the biggest thing is media clutter. We are bombarded with media and media messages. It can actually be overwhelming. And the thing that people do when they're overwhelmed is they tune things out. It's been estimated that the average person receives 3,000 brand messages daily. So people trying to tell them something about their organization. And in the study, this was by the New York Times, they determined that of these some people will even say 5,000 messages that you receive when you're driving, when you're listening to the radio, when you're online, that you actually see or listen to 52 of them. So the other 1,000 just really go by you. They're not even registered. And then people remember 4 of them. So they may see 52, but they actually only remember 4. You have to be strategic and follow best practice if you want to be one of the messages that sticks. And it's thought with increasingly digitized lifestyles that we're reducing our attention span. And so we have to take time to tap into people's motivations and values to ensure what we say is compelling. Because if they're not compelling, we will not hold their attention. We absolutely have to be compelling to grab people's attention, hold their attention, create that curiosity to listen and learn more. And key messages need to stick around for a long time. And that's one of the reasons why we spend the time on them, so we feel confident that we're saying what we need to say in the best manner possible. And you're going to be so tired of your key messages that someone might say, we've been saying this so long, maybe it's time to change it up. And you have to say no. Repetition works. About the time you're absolutely sick of saying it is about the time your target audience has heard it for the first time. And that's really important. I'd like to share 3 guiding principles for our work today. And number 1, the greater your focus, the greater the number you will impact. And so you may choose a target segment that you think will be extremely responsive, persuadable, and able to become an advocate. And then someone might say, well, that's really a small group of people. That's fine. That's fine. If you can find them and speak to them in a compelling way, you will have much more impact than trying to talk to everyone. The other thing I say is key messaging is like parenting. You may not be 100% right all the time, but if you are consistent, good things happen. You want to be concise, clear, and above all, consistent. And then start with the rule of 3. So again, focus on a target audience, be concise, clear, and consistent. It's really tempting to say a little bit more once you've got your key messages and you're about to communicate in some fashion. If you just add a little bit more, then you think we're really missing something. There's a great thing I want them to hear. But what you want to do is entice people to asking to hear or learn more. Saying too many things up front backfires, and that's that concise, clear, and consistency. Sometimes people ask me, how many times does someone have to hear your message before it sinks in? And in the industry, some people will say 7. Someone needs to hear the same message 7 times before they'll even begin to remember it. I don't actually think there's a hard and fast rule, but even if someone has heard your message and it resonates with them, they'll still benefit from hearing it again, and they might even start to share your message. So don't worry if you think people have heard and understand. That's absolutely not a problem. And then default to the rule of 3. Do you notice that the famous things we tend to remember are in 3s? You see the rule is 3 is used across all diverse areas of life. So friends, Roman countrymen, so political statements, blood, sweat, and tears, location, 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 marketing, stop, look, and listen when we're trying to help people do things for the public good, for their safety. The rule of three is very effective, and that's why I really recommend that you try to stick with 3 key messages when you're doing your communications. And I think research does show that information presented in groups of 3 sticks in our head better than any other clusters of item. And again, saying more won't cause people to remember more. They'll remember less. So again, I'll stop for questions. Any questions about what you've just heard? Okay, doesn't look like it. The tool that you will find most helpful to you is called a key message matrix. And it's simply a piece of paper divided into boxes. Your key messages are by your stakeholder group. So the key messages you build for your donors are going to be different than the key messages you build for your fundraisers, for your volunteers. And even within your donors, so when we say what's your target audience, if you're thinking about donors, then within your donors, you still need a target audience. So what kind of people would be most receptive to donating to you, most receptive to your messaging? You still have to define your key audience, even within the stakeholder group. So then you might have the primary message, which is really just the description of your value proposition as a hospice, and that's something that is on your website. That's not the key message we're talking about. We're talking then the 3 key messages that are specific to the segment. So if you, let's say this matrix was key messages by donor, then you would have 3 key messages directed at donors. Then you want to think about proof points. Why should people believe you? And then benefits to the target segment. If you're going to choose to say something to someone, you have to understand how does that benefit them. And then at the bottom of your matrix, you'll make reference to the anecdotes and stories that bring them alive. And then that would be something that someone, when they get the key messages, knows there's a bank or an archive of stories that they can draw upon. That's a key message matrix, and that is the most useful thing that you can build for this exercise. Here's an example. This is Vancouver Airport passenger key messages. So the things that they say about their airport, the statement that they say, their value proposition, is each day YVR makes passenger journeys easy, pleasant, and safe. So their 3 key messages to the traveling public is caring for every customer is central to our operations. Vancouver Airport offers an enjoyable on-site experience, and Vancouver Airport is pioneering technology to streamline and simplify travel. You can see in the proof points below, there's lots of numbers. Numbers are very convincing. Proof points, statistics, and facts do help people believe what you have to say to them. So in the first message there, caring for every customer, 120 customer care reps at 9 information desks, 450 volunteers for directions, informations, and greetings in 33 languages. That's very convincing that they can care for you. The benefit is friendly help when and where you need it. That's the structure of key messaging. If we go to another example, the YWCA, their overarching value proposition is our services support women to gain control of their lives, achieve economic security, and live free from violence. If you go to their homepage, this is what they're going to tell you, the 3 key things that they think people need to know when they get to their website. That they help women and their children move from crisis to stability to opportunity to thrive. I didn't include all the proof points. There are many, but I just want to focus on the message and then the benefit in this case. So why is that important? The cycle of family violence, homelessness, and poverty is broken. The second key message, partner with donors, government, and social services to extend community support for women. And the benefit is creates efficiencies for access to essential programs and services. So the first message, the benefit, is breaking a cycle of family violence and poverty. The second message is efficiency. So there are different ideas with different benefits. And then the third message is challenge and encourage policy in the interest of women and their children. And this is to build a more equal society. So you can see how these are different concepts, but each message has a clear benefit that is attached to it. By creating a key message matrix, you will be compelled to define and prioritize audiences, consider what your key audiences currently think, set a goal about what you want to achieve with your messaging, articulate the 3 most important concepts to communicate, and align your organization around your messages. This is very powerful. If all these things happen, you will be heard more. You will say less and be heard more. Again, any questions? Doesn't seem like it. Okay. So what's the process for developing key messages? Again, target audience, you're going to be tired of me saying this, describe them. You want to describe, age, geography, perhaps what they're experiencing. Maybe you want to talk to people who have experienced people who've been in hospices. Maybe you're talking to people who have or who are involved in other areas. Psychographics, what are their values? What are they really, what motivates them? Those are the things you want to think about. You might not know exactly, but if you have this conversation, you'll think about nailing it down. Then what are their needs or concerns? And the important thing is you're not telling them what you want them to hear. You need to get into their mindset to tell them something they need to hear. And that's why you have to really understand what are their needs or concerns. Then the message, what is the attribute or solution specific to the identified need? Benefits, how does the solution benefit the target audience? And proof points, what supports the message and benefits. And what I always say to myself for proof points is, what would it take to convince a skeptic? What is the most powerful thing you can use in your proof point so that it is indisputably true what you have to say? Here's an application example of a very successful nonprofit that raises significant amounts of money. So it starts with the importance of your work. So clean water means health, income, and education, especially for women and kids. Again, a simple statement. That's what they stand for. They put that out. So when they're talking to their fundraising key messages, they have 3 key messages. Now, this is a public-facing website, and we're not worried about wordsmithing, but even when you look at their key messages, you can see how simple and easy they are. We prove every project, we're an open book, and 100% goes to the field. This is an incredibly successful fundraising organization, and these are the 3 things that they've determined are most important to say to people to get them to open their wallets. So why? We prove every project. Well, what they know about donors is they often feel confused about where their money ends up, or they don't really trust that it's being used as promised. So they prove it, and they do it to the point that they actually will give you the GPS coordinates so you know exactly where your money is being spent. We're an open book, so some nonprofits' excessive or hidden administrative costs have created skepticism in the nonprofit sector. So their key message is we're an open book, and their proof point is we've consistently received the highest grades available for accountability and transparency. So if you're curious about that, then you can go further into their website and see those grades and see what measures they're using. Again, it's a very strong proof point. And 100% goes to the field. as you might have run into in the fundraising world, people tend to want to donate to programs and not operating costs. So they've decided that they have a 100% model, which means that private donors covering operating costs, so that you as a donor, a public from a campaign, know that when you sign up, 100% of your money is going to a specific project that you just saw earlier. You have the GPS coordinates for. So you can see how simple these messages are, how compelling their proof points are, and how they cover a span of donors' concerns. It's what the donors need to hear to help them open their wallets. So there it is again. So this is an organization that I think is a tremendous best case example. So again, any questions or comments? Okay. Okay, so let's get started. I'm going to work with you, give you a chance to create, we're going to try to create actually one key message from start to finish. So the message, the benefit, and then think about the proof points you might need. Key message development is messy. When I'm doing workshops, I always remind people that it is messy. So we're focusing on process today. So if you're going to take a try at doing a key message here, don't worry if you're right or wrong. Go with your best guess. It's the process that you want to learn today. So keep calm and trust the process is what I say. One of the things that you're going to run into is that you know too much. So the number one reason messaging is not memorable is the curse of knowledge. Sometimes the closer you are to a topic, the harder it is to express. So try to adopt a beginner's mindset. Think about people who don't know what you know when you're coming up with messages. Okay, so there's generally three areas of work in nonprofits. So it's the services you offer, fundraising that you have to do, or advocacy. Of these three areas and choose one topic within one of these areas that you think your hospice wants to advance with an external audience. I'll give you a minute to think about that. What area of your work would you want to advance with an external audience with a communications plan? Try to be specific. Okay. Once again, then we'll think about the target audience, what their needs are, what the message is, what the benefits are, and what the proof points are. Okay, your target audience. You've determined what area you are wanting to advance. Think about the target audience you need to talk to. And then ask yourself, instead of asking yourself, what do we want them to hear? Ask yourself, what is going on in the minds of the audience I want to talk to? These are some of the questions you might think about as you are determining your audience's mindset. What's keeping them up at night? Why do they have a particular attitude to your topic? What issues are they struggling with within your area? What might skeptics say? Do they have any positive perceptions now that you can bridge from to bring them on as advocates or donors? Again, I'll give you a minute to think about your target audience. Try to describe them in a way that someone else would know exactly what you mean, who you were talking to, and then write down a few topics of the mindset that you think is important to acknowledge before you begin to write anything about messages. Again, I'll give you a minute. Okay. Now we'll talk about developing messages. And the idea here is don't edit yourself. Write down attributes or solutions that come to mind. Write down as many as you can think of. Right now we'll create choices. So I'll give you a minute to write down everything you would potentially want to say to the target audience you've identified with the mindset you've uncovered about the program or issue you're trying to raise. Okay. Now, look at the messages that you wrote down and prioritize them in order of effectiveness. It's just your best guess. Simply rank them, put numbers beside them, and then choose your top 4. Okay. Now, benefits. Why should they care? Or WIIFM, what's in it for me? Look at one of the concepts you chose. Why is it important to your target audience? How does it improve their situation or the way they feel about something? Write a benefit for the concept or the key message that you chose. Not the benefit to your hospice, the benefit to your target audience. So for example, if you chose donors, they want to feel good. Maybe they want to feel good because of a memory of a loved one. Maybe they want to feel good because they think that people need to stay in their communities when they're ill. Whatever it makes them feel good, does it make them feel good about themselves, feel good about their contribution, feel better about their community? So what is the benefit to them? Okay. Proof points. Now you might not have your proof points with you today, that you might not be able to call them up top of mind, and that's fine. You can think about what area would you look for proof points? What would you like to be able to talk about to prove out what you've decided to say? And again, what would it take to convince a skeptic? Okay. And you might say, well, gee, there's not actually no statistics that support what I have to say. Things that you can think about are quotes from a trusted or credible source. So things that leaders or experts say can be quoted, or articles. Third-party material, maybe some other organization has done some work that you want to show as being strong. Awards, certifications also are useful, or referrals. So if a third party has referred your service or sent people your way, then that's also a proof point. So as much as we want facts and statistics, there are other things that can prove what you're trying to say to people. And then you would write that what you've just your work up in this format. So who were you talking to? What was the key message you think was important? What were the proof points that you would like to uncover to support this? What were the benefits to this particular target segment that you are talking to? And then can you think of any stories or anecdotes that you might want to flesh out to make this more meaningful, more impactful? Okay, what are some traps for key messaging? Cramming too much into each message. If you've got a lot of ands in your key message, it's probably more than one statement. Some people say 9 words. It can be less, it can be a bit more, but don't put too much in a single concept. Crafting copy and slogans. So did you start to worry, think, oh, this would sound really good if I said it this way? This isn't the time to do that. And then the third, which is a little more difficult to grasp, is being too general, which would be motherhood, or being so granular that the statement is so specific that people can't connect it to something bigger and more important. And again, that's why it's great to do key messaging in a group, because you can have that conversation. Does someone think, gee, this is when I hear this, I think motherhood? Or someone say, when I hear this is so specific and such a small idea, I don't think it's going to have any impact. So going back to the example, the Vancouver example, that's how you'd want to write up your work today. Then once you've written it down, you give yourself a litmus test. Matters, tangible, easy. Does it matter? Is it relevant and important to the listener? Again, not to you, to the listener. Tangible. Do you know what you want the listener to think or do as a result? And 3, easy. Easy to say, easy to grasp, easy to remember. Okay, and that's the end of the key messaging segment. We're going to turn it over to Carol for media. If you have any questions about this, I think we'll wait till the end of Carol's section, because I've stolen a couple minutes from her.
Okay, thank you, Linda. Before I start here, I just want to check and see if everyone can hear me all right. I know some of you are on a mic, or if you want to send in a question, if you can hear me properly. So if anybody can't, if anybody can send a quick note or just let me know on the phone. Can everyone hear me all right?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, thank you. Great. Okay. So first of all, it's a pleasure to be here today. In follow-up to Linda's segment, I'm going to deliver to you today a couple of areas of for consideration with regards to the media. Just to give you a little bit of background, I'm a former journalist. I have for many years subsequent to being a journalist worked with companies to provide them some support and direction for communications when dealing with the media. So I've kind of worked a little bit on both sides of the fence here, and hopefully I can provide you some insights both as a former journalist and also as a communication professional. So what I'd like to do is to talk to you a little bit today about providing a little bit of an understanding of the media, why it is they do what they do, and also then to provide you some interview tactics to help you if you are and have an opportunity to do media interviews. And really, how you actually can respond to media inquiries, how you can actually perform well with these interviews, which sometimes can be a scary proposition for folks who've never done it before. So I just wanted to get started by telling you a little bit about some key areas that we always focus in on with media training, and that is some key principles that sort of apply to any interview that you're doing. The first one is called what we refer to it as an artificial reality that you're dealing with. And what I mean by that is that uh, is that you're in a situation where it's not comfortable with regards to a conversation you might be having with a neighbor or a friend over the fence of your your neighborhood fence or across the table over a coffee. It's not it's an uncomfortable situation to be in to begin with, but secondly it is really very much a one-way conversation. So because of that, you want to be prepared with some answers to some questions, for instance, that they might be asking you. You wouldn't do that in a conversation. That would come out with the questions that you're asked in a very casual way, but preparation is really important because it isn't a real comfortable situation to begin with. The second one is that people often aren't sure how to deal with a reporter who might ask some difficult questions or might be a little bit aggressive or rude, and it's really appropriate to push back politely if a reporter is being inappropriate in their approach to you. We'll talk a little bit about more about that going forward. The other thing to remember is that you're always on the record, and I say that because it's not uncommon for reporters to really ask you some questions maybe once they've turned the camera off or the mic is no longer on you or the notebook's been tucked away. They speak with you and ask you questions and you respond. It's important to know that whatever you are sharing with the reporter, it's still as far as they're concerned, fair game to use that information. And so just know that whatever you're speaking to them about, whether directly or indirectly, is something that they could use in an article or the story they're working on, or on television or in the newspaper. The next one is an important one, and I say that in that I've seen this happen a number of occasions where somebody has been quoted in the newspaper and they see the article the next day and they go, well, that's not really what I said. Those weren't my words. I've been misquoted. And very often the reason for that is because the reporter will ask them a question and they'll respond by picking up the language that the reporter uses in their response, which is a very common thing to do when you're in a normal conversation with someone. The reporter will ask the question with a negative connotation or in a negative context, and the response is very often in the same language, and it comes across very differently in print or on camera. And I'll give you an example for that. If I was to ask the question as a journalist, if I'm doing an interview with you and I ask you the question, are there unsafe practices being used in your hospice, in your facility? Normally you might pick up what I said and say, you know what, there are no unsafe practices used by our staff in our facility. That's a pretty common way that you would respond to a question in a normal conversation. But you can appreciate that when you see that in print, there are no unsafe practices used by staff in our facility. There's a negative connotation, but more importantly, it kind of puts a question in the reader's mind as to why you would say that. In other words, are you being defensive, or are you trying to hide something, or is there something more to your response? However, if you were to respond to it in a more positive approach, such as staff in our facility always adhere to safe practices, then you eliminate any kind of doubt or question in the mind of the viewer or the reader as to how you're responding to that. Responses can be important in that people really pick up and read into it in many ways, and so you just want to ensure that there is no misinterpretation on that. The important thing also to remember when you're doing an interview is that you're doing the interview because of your expertise and your knowledge in a particular subject matter, and you really kind of want to stick to that. You really want to focus on what it is you do and what it is that you know, because generally speaking, if you go beyond the scope of those two areas, you often end up answering questions that you may not have the information for, or you may wind up in subject matter that you might not be comfortable talking about. So you really want to stick to, specifically who you are and what you know in terms of the context of your role and responsibility with your organization. So I don't know how many of you have had a chance to do an interview with me yet. Some of you may have already had that opportunity, some of you may have not. But if you were to have had one, generally when we ask this question, once someone has done an interview, the question you ask them is, so if you were to rate yourself on on a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of how accurate, the accuracy of the information you provided that journalist. You know, how confident do you feel in the kind of information you provided, or the statistical data you've provided, or the responses you gave to the questions? Most people rate themselves fairly high. Most people know their stuff, and that's why they're doing the interview. And most people work with this information every day, so they're quite knowledgeable about what they have to say. But if, however, you then ask them, well, how much control do you feel like you had over the interview? That's generally where people will rate themselves somewhat lower, because they'll come away from the interview and they'll say, you know, the reporter asked me a whole bunch of questions that I didn't know they were going to ask me. They were, putting me in a difficult position with some of their questions. They made me feel very uncomfortable. They were asking things out of left field. I really didn't know where the story was going. I didn't have any sense of what they were going to be writing about. So that's where the biggest issue comes from, and where people are reluctant to work with media because they don't like that feeling of lack of control with journalists. And I've seen that in people with very senior positions within large organizations, large companies. We've done lots of media training with CEOs, and that's their biggest concern is that they just don't know how to deal with media because they don't often know what where they're going to go with it. So the question is how do you get control of an interview? And that's where you develop some level of comfort in working with media. And I say that very deliberately. It's to your benefit to work with media. It's to your benefit to see the opportunities in working with media to get your message out. Linda spoke earlier a lot about messaging, and really this is one channel that you can successfully get your message out to the public. So as much as possible, there's some real benefit in learning how to do it well, and how to do it as often as you can in your operations. Before I go ahead further, I'll just check and see, is there any questions that anybody has that they would like to ask on that regard? Okay, I don't see anything at this point, so we'll carry on here. Please do send in any questions as we proceed if you have any that come to mind. Happy to answer them as we go along. I'd love to have some discussion about some of these experiences you may have had or you're worried about having. So now what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about understanding the media. It's a lot of the as I mentioned, the sense of control, lack of control that people have when they're dealing with media is because they don't really understand them. Reporters do have an agenda and approach, which we're going to talk a little bit about, but the other parts to this is going in prepared to talk to media is really important. Do you have an objective with your interview when you go in to talk to them? Again, Linda mentioned talking about getting key messages together and knowing your audiences. If I go into a media interview knowing that really if I have an opportunity to speak directly to my donors on camera or in a newspaper article and say something directly to them, then I've got an objective for that interview. And more importantly, I come out of the interview feeling like I've been successful in at least trying to reach out to those specific audiences that I want to reach. So having messages prepared and knowing who and what you'd like to say if you have an opportunity, regardless of what the reporter wants from you, but you have the objective to reach out to those audiences, that's what's important. The last is knowing how to deal with a difficult interview, how to get out of difficult questions, how to redirect an interview to get your key messages in that you would like to. That's probably the third and most important area that people find difficult when they're in an interview. So let's start by talking a little bit more about understanding the media. It's important to know that news is news, and so reporters are always looking for something new, something different. So if you're wondering why they might ask questions that you might be unsure about, you're maybe wanting to talk to them about what your hospice is doing. They may be looking for a new and different approach, a different angle to a story, so they may start straying around, asking all kinds of different questions. If, for instance, they may come to you to talk about, and you may want to talk about funding issues, for instance, within your organization, and they want to actually talk about medical assisted dying, the reason for doing that is because that's what's in the news and that's what it's about. So understanding that that's in their mind what's news, because that's current and something people are talking about. They may ask questions about that, and you may not feel comfortable speaking about it, and you don't have to, but they will ask you questions about that. The other thing is that they're always looking for stories with close proximity to home. So if something's happened somewhere else in Canada or overseas, they may come to you and say, okay, so what's happening here? Because their audiences as media is the local audiences. And if you're a journalist in Lethbridge, Alberta, then you're going to want to know what's happening in, or apply what this story is about to those in to your readers in Lethbridge. Likewise, if you're a national newspaper, the National Post or the Globe and Mail, your audience is Canada-wide. So your audiences are really determining the kind of interest you have in the article from a proximity point of view. The other area of that is also important, is what does it mean to me? So I want to understand as a reader or a viewer, why do I care? Why do I want to see this story? Why do I want to read this story? And the journalists know that, and they're trying to answer that question. So what's important to their readers and their viewers? A good story also needs emotion and conflict. Now, by the very nature of the kind of work that we all do, that's very important. That by default, there's a lot of that there. But the reason for it is that if you, as a journalist, are writing articles that don't have those elements in it, the stories don't really aren't very they tend to be a little bit boring. That they actually don't. Readers will go on to read something else, because by default we tend to do that. Good books, anything we read, tend to have emotion or conflict in them, because that's what grasps our attention. The other thing that's probably changed significantly in the last number of years is the news hole. And what I mean by that is newspaper articles are much shorter than they used to be. Sound articles on radio or on television are increasingly shorter in their duration, so the sound bite is so important. Again, Linda alluded to how many words that you might want to have in a key message. A sound bite is the same. You need to be able to say a lot in very few words, because that's what will make it on television or in your newspaper. They want short, succinct quotes, and so the more one can define what that looks like beforehand, before doing an interview, knowing that that will be the soundbite that's picked up, the more of a benefit it is. If you speak in long sentences, they cannot use those long quotes, so they're either going to cut it shorter themselves, or they're going to look for something that you say, something quick and short and to the point. Again, it takes practice and learning on how to speak in sound bites. The other thing is staying on message is really important. Very often we will start to sway back and forth into other subject areas, but if again you want some key areas and key messages to get across, you just want to keep sticking to those areas that you want to talk about. So just very quickly here, what is news? This is these are basics for any news story. Oops, sorry. Which is why if reporters ask you a certain number of questions, it's because they have to really answer these questions in any news story. Who are we talking about? What happened? Where did it happen? When did it happen? Why did it happen? And how did it happen? Those are just the very basics and fundamentals for any, as I said, any news story, and that's journalism 101. They have to learn very quickly how to ask all of those kinds of questions. Even if they don't know about the subject matter, that's why they will ask those questions. Reporters in general, just so people sort of get a sense and understanding of them. If you understand reporters and where they're coming from, sometimes it's helpful to understand why they may ask you questions the way they do, or at least help to excuse why their behavior may be inappropriate. The most important thing that to know is that their world has changed dramatically over the last few years, and I'll give you an example of this. when I was a former journalist, we generally were assigned, or we undertook a story a day. What I meant by that is that you would get in work in the morning and you one story you would determine what that would be for the day. You would do the interviews, you would do your research, and then you would write the article up by the end of the day so it appeared in the newspaper the next day. By the time I left the industry, we were doing 3 like that. So you can imagine how much work is involved in putting together 3 stories for the next day. Now, mind you, they were shorter, so you didn't do as much work behind them, but it still encompassed a great deal more work. And also, since then, many journalists are working in a number of different mediums. So they're writing stories for a newspaper or print. They're doing them for an online edition of the publication. They're doing a camera, a webcam type article, even if they're in the newspaper. They're obviously television is writing stories for the online, and they're doing stories live on television and maybe radio. They've got a whole bunch of different demands. They're tweeting, they're doing blogs. It's a whole different world in terms of the amount and volume of work that they're doing. So they're very often running in to cover something. They're rushed. They can be quite direct in terms of their questions, because really they're right in and out to get to the next story. The other thing is that they have to become instant experts at many things. They've always been, that's one of their traits, I think, and their skills, is a reporter can come in and cover an article about something that they didn't know anything about previously, because they know what questions to ask to at least be able to get to a point where they understand enough to be able to write something, or to, as I say, do an article for television or radio. Now, they basically know a little about a lot of things. Generally speaking, they really kind of scratch the surface on some areas, but more importantly, they at least know what to pick up. That's even more the case now. Most journalists are generalists. They're not specific. They don't cover specific areas. Again, when I was a journalist, I would cover a certain area where, for instance, hospices fell into my area of expertise, and I would be able to learn about them at a much deeper level than reporters have an opportunity to do now. So you have to know when they come in that they may know very little about you, and be okay with that, and be able to share that, some background with them and some information to help them understand who you are, and not feel frustrated that they ask questions that you wonder why they're asking those questions, but basically they are trying to come up to speed very quickly on a subject they may not know a lot about or have very limited information about. The most important thing in terms of reporters and what their needs are is that they need people to talk to, and they need stories, and they need to have you help them provide what they need to do those stories. And I say that because it's really helpful for them, for you. The more you can help a journalist do their job, the more you will benefit from their ability to do it. If they don't have time to get the facts and figures themselves, but you can provide it to them, first of all, their articles will be more accurate to begin with, but secondly, they see the benefit in the relationship they have with you, and that will work in your favor. So the more you can help them do their job well, the more you will benefit as an organization in the long run from that relationship as well. So in terms of a reporter calling you to do an interview, if they decide that they're going to give you a call, you want to make yourself available if it's possible, or someone available if not yourself. Now, that doesn't mean to say that you have to be at the end of the phone all day long every time they call, but if there was a call, you may want to call them back and say, I understand you're interested in doing an interview. We're happy to do one with you, but we might need 10 minutes or half an hour or an hour, and then we will phone you back. But we do recognize that that you are looking for somebody, and we'll do what we can to help, because at least the reporter knows that you're trying to help them, and again, that will give you lots of brownie points with them. Also, as I said, depending on their deadline, sometimes they need something in the next 15 minutes because they're putting together an article that's going to go up online, and that turnaround time is very quick. But alternatively, you may have more time. So it's important to ask them what their timing is on the articles that they're working on, and what can be done to suit your time frame a little bit better. Also, if you have facts and figures and brochures or informations or summaries about your organization, suggest that you'll send it to them via email, because if you don't have information available to them, they don't have time necessarily to go and find it. They're not going to spend time on your website finding out a little bit more about you. They don't really have the time. But if you could cut and paste a few paragraphs and say, listen, we'll provide you some background information about who we are and what we do, and I'll email it to you, they will be eternally grateful, because it helps them get their information quicker. It also provides accurate information for them. The more you can give them, the better, also in terms of photos and video, because increasingly now, as I mentioned, the online media has changed the world for them, and they need these kinds of visuals. Before that was even more the case, but it's even more, that was the case, but it's even more so now. The other thing to note is that if you have a photo that works very well with the article in a newspaper, it gets the article tends to get better play in the newspaper than if you don't have a photo. Just by default, photos lend themselves better to on the page of a newspaper, so the prominence of the article is also all that much better. And photos, I mean by not just headshots, but visually interesting pictures. The other thing they also need is what we call real people. It's great for them to speak to yourselves as perhaps key people within your organizations, but they want to speak to the average Joe. And what I mean by that is that they want to speak to, perhaps it may be your patients' families or donors or people who are working with you, but who viewers and readers can relate to when they're listening to a story. If you've ever watched or listened to medical stories, that's a primary formula that you see, where you may have somebody, it's a physician, and there may be a researcher who's speaking, but they also always have a patient of some sort who can speak to it directly. So knowing that and having people prepared ahead of time, if a reporter calls and said they want to talk to on a subject matter, or you would like them to do a story about you, you really want to try and put out people like that whom they can also interview as well. They don't want to have they don't have the time or the opportunity to go and find those people themselves, so providing that to them is very helpful. So the different types of media are very obvious in some ways, but the implications are a little bit different. Television is all about the visuals. So when an interview is being done live on television or taped on television, what is behind you, what's around you is obviously very important. So you want to think about that if you're asked to do an television interview, because you do want to have something visual behind you if you can. A boardroom isn't necessarily an appropriate place to do it. It's not very visually appealing. If you have a logo in your organization, perhaps on a wall, even standing in front of the logo, again, that reinforces the name of your organization. So sometimes it's just important to think about what it is that surrounds you when you're doing this interview. With radio, it's really all about the soundbite, short and sweet. Comments are really important. There are various different kinds of radio interviews, though. There is live interviews, there's taped interviews, there's taped to live interviews, there's very short interviews, there's lunch, say perhaps lunchtime talk shows. All of those have different implications for interviews, and some of them are more difficult than others to do. Short, quick radio interviews are easy, but if you get into a live conversation, then the reporter can ask you lots more questions and go off in all kinds of different directions. So sometimes knowing what the format of the news clip is going to be is important, because you may decide not to do it. You may decide that that's just an area you're not comfortable with, and sometimes that's best to make that decision if that's the case. Excuse me. With newspapers, they have more space, less so than they used to, but they still have more space to put context around what they're talking about, much more so than radio or TV. So you have more opportunity to talk about who you are and what you do and what's important to you and getting your messaging out. You have a little bit more time and effort to not only talk to the reporter, but more chance of getting some of that into the newspapers. Social media is really all about the more content, the better. Increasingly, all of the media outlets have social media channels that they never had before, and so they have to provide as much content as possible. So the more you can give them, like I mentioned, with photos and video, news releases, there's a lot of information they may put up just because they need to fill a lot of space. So that serves you well. Anything going through traditional media that you can get through traditional media is a much more beneficial approach than spending money on advertising or other means that you might need to do some marketing. And I say that in that there's a lot of credibility that goes along with any kind of traditional media coverage. If you do a media interview, for instance, in a newspaper, there's a lot of research to show that the same amount of space, the equal amount of space used for a paid advertisement, which as we know is quite expensive, has a lot less effect. The article with a journalist gives you immediate credibility, and it also there's a lot more value attached to it. So, you know, knowing that, being able to provide as much as possible to media to be able to get your message out is particularly helpful. Excuse me. Spokespersons it's always an area of interest for organizations because they will often say we're not sure who to provide to speak to the media if they're interested in speaking to us. Should it be the president or the CEO of the organization, or should it be one of our subject matter experts? In other words, maybe one of our clinicians or physicians or someone who is specifically involved on the medical side of what we do. The real answer to that is it kind of really depends on what the interview is about, but more importantly, it's okay to split and important to split these interviews up. If it's an area of particular focus where you're better off to have one of your head clinicians do the interview, then you should do it. It's important to remember that journalists actually find subject matter experts to be the most credible source, and there's again a lot of research, not only just journalists but the public, because if you're a subject matter expert, you have less vested interest in positioning the organization in any particular way, and you are the expert. You have the knowledge and the information on a particular topic. So you really want to decide when is it best for yourself or other colleagues in the organization to do the interview and under what conditions should you do it. And it's good to spread it out as well, because there's some benefit in having more than one person always speaking to the media. The communications role, depending on the organization, some of you may have a communications person within your organization. Some may get some contract support to do this, regardless of whether, or some of you may be just doing all of this yourself, which is absolutely not unusual at all. Really, that role for a lot of people is to help support getting media, coordinating interviews with the media, providing them information to support the stories they're working on. Really be the go-between between the organization and the reporters themselves. That role is helpful if you have one within your organization to develop relationships with media, because they really do rely on relationships with you, and the better relationships you can have with journalists, whether they're locally or provincially, the better. So the more you can actually, whether it's taking them out for lunch, journalists always love to be bought lunch, because just so you know, journalists don't do a lot of their work for the large salaries they get. And generally speaking, they do it because of the love of the kind of job and work that they do, and the rewarding kind of work that they have an opportunity to do. So, those kinds of things make a difference for journalists, and it's always helpful to develop those relationships. So if you're going to be asked to do an interview, there's a couple of checklists here that are helpful to think about before you do. First of all, get an understanding of who the reporter is and what the organization is they work for. And I say that in that it helps you understand where they're coming from. Because you might have a different thought about whether you want to do an interview with CBC, and you might very much want to, or there may be another organization that you've had bad experiences with in the past, or this particular reporter has not always been supportive of maybe your organizations and whether you want to interview with them or not. I mentioned earlier it's important to have those relationships, but I also understand that sometimes you have to make some decisions about whether it's right to do the interview or not. The second thing is, what's their story? It's really okay to ask the reporter, what is the story you're working on? And also, who else are you talking to? Because that's helpful to understand who where they're going with the article, who else is being interviewed. And also, as I mentioned earlier, the format, what kind of format? Is this going to be an online article? Are you putting this up in an hour, or are you working on a longer article for next weekend's paper? Because that gives me some time to really give you a whole bunch more research that you could that might benefit you. And again, also the deadline. Is it within the next hour? Because that's quite different than if it's in a few hours from now. And you can always provide a couple of sound bites to a reporter, even if you can't answer the questions to their interview. If they need something in the next 15 or 20 minutes, and you think, you know what, I have an opportunity here to get the name of our organization into the paper, maybe I can say something. You can say something, and some of that is those key messages that Linda alluded to. You can always at least say, well, if you ask me a couple of questions, I don't know if I can answer them, but let me share with you a few things that I could provide you that might be helpful. So at least, at the very least, you can kind of throw something at them, and they may use it for the article, they may not. If they find that it's not helpful, they won't, but sometimes that's a shot in the dark that sometimes does pay. They just need somebody to talk to, and they have to get something up very quickly, so take advantage of it if you can. So again, questions to ask yourself before you do the interview. First of all, are you comfortably trained? I mean, this is certainly part of this discussion about media, but feeling comfortably trained to do media interviews, that takes time, it takes practice, and they're not always going to go well, especially at the beginning, because it is a new and uncomfortable situation. But certainly, the more you do it, the better you get at it. And if you feel like you've at least got a sense of understanding of your messaging, and as I say, a little bit more confident in some of the things you should and shouldn't do, then at least that's a good start. As we mentioned, we talked about the messages, but the other thing is that have some of those tools available that we talked about in terms of background information and facts and figures. Have all of that ready to go. You won't have time to be able to do it at the time of the interview request. So be prepared for these interviews, and also know, like I said, if you're going to do an interview, where you're going to do it. If a newspaper reporter comes over to visit you, they still may want a photograph. So you still need to think about where that interview is going to be, or at the very least, where they could take a photograph of you that is quite interesting in terms of the background. So I know I'm going through some of this quickly, but we will take questions at the end here, I think, just in terms of time. So I just wanted to get into some interview tactics here, which I think are important, that hopefully will, you can take away a few of these at the very least, and find you'll be able to apply these fairly quickly and fairly soon, even in just some of your practice runs that you're doing on some of this. Before you answer a question that a reporter might ask you, so you've been agreed, you've looked at all of your research before an interview, you've decided you're going to do the interview, you know who the reporter is maybe, and what you want to, what they're going to do a story about. So you've decided to do this interview. So the reporter starts asking you some questions, and they're going to throw a question out at you, and you're kind of going to go, should I be answering this question? That's your first thought before you even say, how am I going to answer it? Should I be answering this question? And in a nanosecond, you'll be able to know whether you should be answering this question or not. Because reporters will just throw questions out at you. Very often, you don't know where they're coming from. They don't even make sense in some cases. They'll just throw some stuff out at you and not make sense in the context of the conversation you're having. But if you were to ask yourself these two questions fairly quickly and answer them fairly quickly, you'll know whether you want to answer the question or not. So the first thing you want to ask yourself is, do I have the authority to answer the question they've just asked? In other words, am I the right person in the organization? And do I have the, am I in the right position to be able to answer this question on behalf of the organization? Now, many of you may be senior people in your organization, and you do have the authority, but if it's a question that's broader in scope, where in fact it should be, perhaps it should be Jennifer from the AHPCA answering the question, you may want to say, you know what, I actually can't answer this question. I might say, I'm not the best person to speak to about that. This is a provincial-wide, policy or mandate, and perhaps you might want to speak to Jennifer. about that, and I'll get you her contact information. She could respond to that. So while we do have authority to answer some questions, we may be in a more difficult position to answer something else. So again, ask yourself that: am I the right person to answer the question? Likewise, do I have the expertise to answer the question? And in many cases, expertise means information or knowledge. So I might ask a question that's specific. And as the leader of the organization, you may go, well, I don't actually know those facts and figures off the top of my head, or I don't have that level of detailed information. Maybe it's a medical question that you just don't have the expertise to respond to. Then I would suggest you say, well, you don't know the answer to that. And in fact, I would say it's best not to try and answer the question, and don't answer it, and say, you know, I'm sorry, I can't answer that question. I can get that information to you at a later date. I can get back to you with some statistical information if you need it, or I have someone else in our organization who would be a better person to respond to that. So don't feel compelled to answer questions if for either of those reasons you aren't the best person to answer the question. And it's okay. The reporter will go on and ask you a different question then. And it's quite comfortable. You should feel quite comfortable to be able to say that, because they don't know. They don't know all the roles and responsibilities you have and what you do and don't know about things. So they'll just ask you questions and hope for the best. The other area which people feel quite uncomfortable about is answering difficult questions. So a reporter may ask you a difficult question and you are not sure how to answer that. There's ways around it to that'll help you to feel comfortable. So a common question is actually not a question, it's a statement. They'll say something like, you know, something is a huge concern. That's a very common approach that a reporter will get into a discussion with you about. So for instance, let's take an example closer to home. Provincial funding cuts are a huge concern, aren't they? Well, you know, that's a tough one to answer, because either way you answer that, you're probably going to get into a discussion that may be challenging. You may not want to go there on a camera, in front of a camera or in a newspaper, to talk about those particular issues, because maybe that's something you'd rather, you know, speak directly to the province about, as an example. But you can turn that around. So rather than answering that question, you could say, well, you know, the issue you raise here is, do we have the funds to sustain our programs? Well, you know, currently right now we have a waiting list of people to get in, and we don't have the right number of beds for our community. You could, you know, change the conversation a little bit in a different direction. So it's just really understanding that you don't have to answer that question. You can actually respond to the question. And we do differentiate between the two. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. But in this kind of a question, you can do that. The guarantee question is another one. Very tough to guarantee anything. You know, can you guarantee us that this incident in your facility won't happen again? Well, it's hard to guarantee anything. You know, what we can assure you, or what we can guarantee you, is that we've got processes in place to take a look at what's happened here. We are, you know, changing our policies going forward. We've got the right people in place within our staff to be able to manage this properly. So you can guarantee processes and systems and people. It's just difficult to guarantee situations. Other similar questions like this. Overall, would you say? That's a big question. You know, overall, would you say this? It's a very broad question and is vague. And then a technique that's used very often, and this is great to use with your kids, by the way, is or family members, is, you know, what I hear you asking is this. You reframe the question that was asked, and you frame it in a way that you can give an answer. So what I hear you really asking is this. You reshape the question and then provide an answer. And sometimes that works. Sometimes the reporter will say, well, no, that's not really what I asked you. I asked you this, but you can at least respond in that way. Sometimes they're quite accepting of that kind of a response. And this is a good way to get a key message in. You know, what I hear you asking is this. Well, let me tell you about us. And that's sometimes a real nice way to get into a response with a key message. So those are a couple of, and I'm going to jump ahead here a little bit because I know we're getting on with time. But the last one I just wanted to point out is that if a reporter ever asks you something specifically personally, best to change the language to we. In other words, you know, not you personally, but the organization is responding, and you never want to really kind of get into a conversation about what your views are about something. It's more about what the organization feels about something. Likewise, some what we call bridging. These are an opportunity to bridge to key messages if you can. A reporter will ask you a question. You know, that's a really interesting point you've made, but more specifically, or, you know, but you know what, let me tell you about what it is that, you know, what we're doing here. So it's a way to bridge over to something you may want to talk about a little bit more close to home. Another way that you really want to focus in on a particular key message, if they ask a question where you know this is an opportunity for you to get across something that you would like to say, the important aspect you raise here is this. And when readers or listeners hear those words, they will actually often listen a little closer. The important aspect you raise here is this. And then whatever it is you say, very often people will be a little bit more tuned in when you say that. The other couple I just wanted to mention here, and you can see there's a little bit of a list, and these slides will go up later on in a couple of weeks after the session, so you can have these a little closer to home and look at them a little bit more closely if you'd like to do that. I'm not sure about that, but what I do know is this. And that's a great phrase to use when a reporter asks you a question and you really don't want to necessarily agree with what they're saying. You know, I'm not sure about that. But what I can tell you is this is a very polite way of getting around you know, not saying, no, I don't agree with you, that's wrong, that's different, you know, that's not what I understand. So a shift to the kind of words that you'd rather use is important there. So nonverbal communications. I'm just going to spend a few minutes again going through this here a little bit as well. Oops, sorry. All of you have probably heard at some point that, you know, it's really not what we it's not really what you're saying, but how you're saying it that can make a difference when you're communicating with others. There's all kinds of research to show that anywhere between 50 and 70% of what we say is not what we say, but it's how our body the body language that we use. It's what our eyes are signaling when we're speaking, when we're saying those words. It's what our gestures are. It's how we're sitting or standing. That's very much a reflection of what we're really communicating. So I am watching you, whether I realize it or not. I'm really watching your body language, and I'm really watching how you're responding physically to me, more so than I am hearing what the words are. This is particularly true on camera when you're doing a media interview. Those gestures are accentuated, so it's important to know that. And if you speak, for instance, a lot with your hands, it's helpful to know that when you do that on a camera, it can be quite disconcerting because you're seeing your hands moving back and forth. Camera interviews tend to do a shot where you've really got head and shoulders of someone, and if you're moving your hands around, then I will be watching your hands more than I'll be listening to what you have to say. Likewise, if you've got bright colors or busy designs on your clothing, my eyes tending to go to those rather than, again, listening to the words that you're saying. So really knowing that everything you're doing visually is important to try and keep it to a minimal, so that I'm just listening to you more than I'm watching all of those other things going on. Looking at someone in the eye when you speak to them is much more they not only do it through communications, not only are they listening to you more, but they tend to trust you more. I'm not going to say something that's not true if I'm looking at you in the eye. It's a lot harder to do that. So by default, they'll believe you, and more importantly, you've got their attention. And that's true even when you're talking on camera. If a reporter's standing in front of you and they have a camera you know, in your face, they'll often say, well, just look at the reporter, because you really want to be looking at the reporter in the eye, not in the camera when you're speaking. And that is reflective in the interview when you're doing it, when viewers watch you. So some key do's and don'ts during an interview, and these again are short tips, but some of these can make a big impact when you're doing an interview. If a reporter asks you a question based on some misinformation, you really want to correct that information as quickly as you can. They will assume the information is correct if you don't, and sometimes it feels rude to correct them, but it's really okay to say, well, you know, I'm not sure where you get your information from, but that's not my understanding. This is the information that we work from, so you might want to check that. And very often they'll say, okay, well, this was misinformation, I apologize, but you just don't want them to walk away thinking that whatever they've asked, whatever that information is, that they find it to be correct. So clarify it if you can, if there is a mistake. If they ask you a question you don't understand, it's really polite, appropriate, and totally polite to ask them for clarification. You can do that, and if you still don't understand the question, you could repeat that again and say, maybe you could rephrase this, maybe, or what I understand I hear you saying is this. That's a great line to use in this circumstance. So even if you really don't understand, you can paraphrase their question and answer it that way. Using illustrations and analogies, Linda alluded to this as well, really important in getting your message across. You don't want to be going through long lists of facts and figures and information because you have to keep your quotes short and sweet. And using an illustration or an analogy to get your message across is very effective. Remaining positive even through tough questions. Again, sometimes it can be hard if a reporter is asking you some tough questions to not get discouraged or annoyed or angry, but the more you can just continue to remain positive and overlook their approach to your questioning, the better. Using plain language, again, Linda mentioned this as well. Using terminology within the organization, within your industry, or acronyms can be very difficult. Most people don't know what some of these acronyms are, even though we who are working around them all the time, we take it for granted. They don't, and also terminology that we think may be common usage, it often isn't for a lot of people, especially newcomers to Canada, or more importantly even just the general public. We assume that they know certain things, but we shouldn't assume that. So very simple language and very short and sweet, to the point. It's really okay to give the same answer to the same question. Reporters sometimes will ask you the same question in different ways to get a different answer. Don't worry about that. Just continue to repeat your same answer, because it's important to remember it will only show up once in the newspaper or on television once. Even though if it feels weird and you feel like saying, I've already answered this question this way, you just have to say it exactly the same way again. Because if you stray off your message, very often you'll end up giving a different answer, and it's not really the message that you wanted to give. It's very easy to change it up to the point where it's not quite the same as what you really wanted to get across. Focusing on solutions, important. Remaining polite. So again, just getting through some don'ts here, so we can leave a few minutes time for some questions. If I ask you to speculate on something, or I provide a hypothetical question, situation that I might want you to give an answer to, better not to. It's hard always, the best of times, to speculate on something, but again, you may be finding yourself going into territory that you're not familiar with. The best thing to say is, I can't speculate on what would happen in this situation. What I can tell you is, through our experience, this is what's happened. So go back to something you know and that you're comfortable with, rather than speculating on something that may or may not happen. I mentioned earlier about not repeating the negative. That's a really big one. Just flip over the negative question and flip it to a positive, so that you can answer the question in a different way than the question was asked. Don't use jargon or too many facts, as I mentioned. Proof points are very important. Linda alluded to these as well. But if you're going to use proof points in a quote, if you want to get proof points into a quote in the paper or on media, maybe make it 1 or 2 facts at the most, or statistics at the most. If you put in too many, they can't use them all. So keep them to the key and most important ones when you're dealing with media. It doesn't mean to say that you don't have many more of those proof points, but when you're looking to do a media interview, just think of the few top key ones, most important ones that you'd like to get across. Never a good idea to say no comment, or this is off the record, because first of all, no comment always looks bad. If you say, if you, rather than saying I don't know the answer to the question or can't answer the question, if you say no comment, that has a different connotation yet again. It's just best to say. In many ways you can say, you know what, I can't answer that question. I'm not in a position to answer that right now. Legally, I'm not in a position to answer that question, or for the privacy of our patients, we can't answer those questions. There's lots of ways to say no comment without actually saying no comment. You obviously these are some clear ones, but don't get angry or insult a reporter, because that never serves anyone well. And I have seen that happen in many occasions, even for polished politicians. They lose their cool, but sometimes it just doesn't pay off. So as much as sometimes you feel annoyed by something a reporter has done, best just not but best to get back past that and just remember the things we mentioned earlier about why reporters do what they do. Not running away from a reporter either, which people have been known to do when they see a reporter coming, run the other way. Just lastly, and in closing, the most important thing is that you want to develop some messages around who you are and what you do and why you're different than everyone else, and what it is that's the most important thing you want to tell people about your organization. If you can put together some messaging that says that about you and captivate somebody to the point where they're going to ask you some questions, as Linda mentioned, what you want to do is you want to leave them with wanting to ask you more questions. The way that we often frame this is that if you can get on an elevator and go up a couple of floors with someone in the elevator, and as you know, that's a fairly short trip, within that time frame you can tell them what you want to tell them about your organization, and they get off on the next floor and they want to stop and ask you more questions, then you know that you've accomplished that goal. So think about it in terms of the short, sweet, to the point, engaging messaging around your organization, and that will be the true test. So I'll leave it there now, and I think that if you have some time for questions, I know, as I said, that we're running a little bit over time, but if you have some questions, we'd be delighted to share some discussion with you. So. By all means, if you're on the phone and you'd like to ask a question, or if you'd like to type one in, please do so. We'd also look forward to your feedback. So if you have an opportunity to provide some feedback on the content, if you have any suggestions or questions afterwards, please don't hesitate to let us know, and we can certainly get back to you with any additional information you might need. We do have a question here about the slides, and yes, the slides will be made available, and I think you will receive an email in terms of where to get that information once it's up and available to you. Okay. Well, with that, thank you very much. I'm going to pass it back now, and we'd like to say thank you on behalf, I know, of Linda and I'm going to pass back to Jennifer, and we'll look forward to hopefully having another opportunity to talk again soon. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I want to thank Carol and Linda for their excellent presentations today, and I want to thank you for joining us today, and thanks again for staying if you were able to stay for a bit longer so that you could get to the end of the material. As Carol mentioned, we will be posting copies of the broadcasts and the slides on our website, and we'll let you know when that's going to happen. It may happen before Christmas, or it may be sometime shortly thereafter. And again, as Carol said, if you do have any questions or feedback, please email me at director@ahpca.ca with anything, if you need more information on something or if you have some feedback you'd like to give us. I believe that both Carol and Linda would be happy to have you contact them directly if you would like to do that. And so when we put up the information, we'll make sure that you have access to some information for them. Again, thanks so much, and I hope everyone has an excellent weekend. Talk to you
Thank you.
soon. Bye.
Thank you.